Have you ever seen a human-like robot, doll, or animatronic that was so lifelike it gave you the creeps? Maybe you feel uncomfortable seeing a clown or zombie, but you're not sure why. The uneasiness you may feel is known as the Uncanny Valley Phenomenon, which is noticeable when something is so close to being human, but lacks that certain something that's hard to describe. This uncanny valley is why some people say they feel uncomfortable in wax museums. The characters are so incredibly lifelike, yet there's just something off enough about them, and our brains process it as being something to fear. Yet wax museums have been popular tourist attractions for years. And it was one woman who became so skilled at her wax sculptures, her museums have attracted guests for more than 250 years. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Madame Tussaud. But first, a quick message. I know I haven't gotten into the meat of this episode yet, but if you've listened to past episodes of The Story Behind, I'd love to know what you think. You can leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you use to listen, or you can email me at thestorybehindpod@gmail.com. Or you can find The Story Behind on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at The Story Behind Pod and message me through any of those. Thanks for listening. Madame Tussaud, or Tussaud as some pronounce it, was born Anna Marie Groschholz in Strasbourg in the Alsace region of France in 1761. The date is unclear, but many surmise it was December 8th. Anna Marie, usually called just Marie, and her mother Anne traveled to Bern, Switzerland, when Anne became a housekeeper to Dr. Philippe Curtius, a physician who was skilled at creating wax figures to aid in teaching others anatomy and medical study. Marie became interested in the art of sculpting wax and began learning from Dr. Curtius, whom she called her uncle. Curtius moved to Paris in 1767 to open an exhibition space, with Marie and her mother following. Marie became his assistant, and through Curtius's connections, she met many of the French nobility, including philosophers Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, both of whom she fashioned wax replicas. She and Curtius's wax exhibition found success, and Tussaud even said she was commissioned to teach her skill to Princess Elizabeth, the sister of Louis XVI, at the Palace of Versailles. But this was shortly before the French Revolution, when having any sort of connection to royalty put one on a list of enemies. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Tussaud was sentenced to die by guillotine. But when revolutionists found out her skills as a wax modeler, she was recruited to make death masks, including masks for guillotine victims Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Following the revolution, she married François Tussaud and gave birth to 3 children, one of whom died. But her 2 sons, Joseph and François, would follow in their mother's footsteps and carry on her business following her death. She took her son Joseph and her wax figure collection to England to exhibit in 1802 and remained there throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Her collection became an instant success in Britain, since it was the first time the English saw the features of the guillotined King and Queen of France they had mourned following the Revolution. In a time when most married women didn't work and travel wasn't as easy as it is today, it's a wonder she traveled with her collection for almost 33 years. She returned to London in the 1820s, reuniting with her son François, and set up a permanent exhibition space for her collection on Baker Street in 1835. Her husband remained in France and had squandered most of the family's investments. It was Punch magazine who coined the name Chamber of Horrors for what was known as her separate room in her museum. This was the room in which the displays of guillotine heads and death masks from the French Revolution are displayed. Madame Tussaud died in 1850 after a bout of severe asthma. She is said to have sat at the front desk of her London museum up until she was physically unable to. Her sons took over the collection, and following them their grandsons. The museum has had its fair share of devastation and rebuilding. In 1925, a fire destroyed the museum, and if you thought wax figures weren't creepy enough, you'll be pleased to know that on the internet, there are pictures of the melted wax figures following the fire that are even creepier. Luckily, the fire didn't destroy any of the molds used to make the figures, and many were easily replaced. But in 1940, during World War II, a bomb destroyed 352 head molds and the cinema of the museum. In the second half of the 20th century, additional Madame Tussauds began opening around the world. And for grammar nerds out there, if you're looking for the apostrophe in Madame Tussauds, it's missing on purpose. Merlin Entertainment Group, which took over ownership of the Tussaud Group in 2007, decided that since Madame Tussaud doesn't technically own the franchise anymore, there's no need for the possessive apostrophe. Information for this episode was sourced from encyclopedia.com, MadameTussauds.com, HistoryToday.com, RidiculouslyInteresting.com, Mental Floss, and CNN. For these links and more, visit the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.